Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Hello, everyone. Today, Joseph and I, because Lisa can't be here, are going to delve into something we touched on earlier in the podcast, which is Hans Christian Andersen's story of the Ugly Duckling. And today we're going to really take a deep dive, read the tale, and please just sit back and let yourselves be read to, and really see where the tap roots around trauma and attachment and other kinds of developmental processes that are implicit in this tale take us in our lives today.
Before we begin with the episode, I'd like to invite all of you to consider becoming our patrons. As part of our mission for This Jungian Life, we have decided to reject all corporate sponsorship. This allows us to make all the content decisions on our own without any outside pressure so that we can respond to your suggestions and also continue the mission of making Jung's ideas accessible to as many people as we can. In order to continue that mission, we need your help. So please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and at the top, click our Patron button. This will redirect you to our Patreon account, and you can make a one-time donation or a monthly donation at various tiers. We provide extra episodes and dream interpretations, but more importantly, we appreciate your generosity. And it's a wonderful thing when we feel companioned in this important work. So we hope that you'll give us a hand.
So here is the story of the Ugly Duckling that has been a part of, I think, almost every therapist's consulting room on a regular basis, and I think part of almost everyone's felt experience at times. And it's interesting with Hans Christian Andersen that even though he was born somewhere along the lines of 1805 or 6, that we consider his works fairy tales because they have such a depth of mythological sensitivity and sensibility. So here is this relatively modern fairy tale, The Ugly Duckling. It was so beautiful out on the country. It was summer. The wheat fields were golden, the oats were green, and down among the green meadows the hay was stacked. There the stork minced about on his red legs, clacking away in Egyptian, which was the language his mother had taught him. Round about the field and meadowlands rose vast forests, in which deep lakes lay hidden. Yes, it was indeed lovely out there in the country. In the midst of the sunshine, there stood an old manor house that had a deep moat around it. From the walls of the manor right down to the water's edge, great burdock leaves grew, and there were some so tall that little children could stand upright beneath the biggest of them. In this wilderness of leaves, which was as dense as the forest itself, a duck sat on her nest, hatching her ducklings. She was becoming somewhat weary because sitting is such a dull business and scarcely anyone came to see her. The other ducks would much rather swim in the moat than waddle out and squat under the burdock leaf to gossip with her. But at last the eggshells began to crack one after another. Peep, peep, said the little things as they came to life and poked out their heads. Quack, quack, said the duck, and quick as quick can be, they all waddled out to have a look at the green world under the leaves. Their mother let them look as much as they pleased because green is good for the eyes. "How wide the world is," said all the young ducks, for they certainly had much more room now than they had when they were in their eggshells. "Do you think this is the whole world?" their mother asked. "Why, it extends on, clear across to the other side of the garden, and right on into the parson's field, although that is further than I have ever been. I do hope you are all hatched," she said as she got up. "No, not quite all. The biggest egg still lies here. How much longer is this going to take? I'm really rather tired of it all," she said, but she settled back on her nest. "Well, how goes it?" asked an old duck who came to pay her a call. "It takes a long time with that one egg," said the duck on the nest. "It won't crack, but look at the others. They're the cutest little ducklings I've ever seen. They look exactly like their father, the wretch. He hasn't come to see me at all." "Let's have a look at the egg that won't crack," the old duck said. "Oh, it's a turkey egg, and you can take my word for it, I was fooled like that once myself. What trouble and care I had with those turkey children, for I may as well tell you they're afraid of the water. I simply could not get them into it. I quacked and snapped at them, but it wasn't a bit of use. Let me see the egg. Certainly it's a turkey egg. Let it lie and go teach your other children to swim." "Oh, I'll sit a little longer. I've been at it so long already, I might as well sit here half the summer." "Suit yourself," said the old duck, and away she waddled. At last, the big egg did crack. "Peep," said the young one, and out he tumbled. But he was so big and ugly. The duck took a look at him. "That's a frightfully big duckling," she said. "He doesn't look the least like the others. Can he really be a turkey baby? Well, I'll soon find out. Into the water he shall go, even if I have to shove him in myself." Next day, the weather was perfectly splendid, and the sun shone down on all the green burdock leaves. The mother duck led her whole family down to the moat. Splash, she took to the water. "Quack, quack," said she, and one duckling after another plunged in. The water went over their heads, but they came up in a flash and floated to perfection. Their legs worked automatically, and they were all there in the water. Even the big, ugly gray one was swimming along. "Why, that's no turkey," she said. "See how nicely he uses his legs and how straight he holds himself. He's my very own son after all, and quite good looking if you look at him properly. Quack, quack, come with me. I'll lead you out into the world and introduce you to the duck yard. But keep close to me so that you won't get stepped on, and watch out for the cat." Thus they sallied into the duck yard, where all was in an uproar because two families were fighting over the head of an eel. But the cat got it, after all. You see, that's the way of the world. The mother duck licked her bill because she wanted the eel's head for herself. Stir your legs, bustle about, and mind that you bend your necks to that old duck over there. She's the noblest of us all and has Spanish blood in her. That's why she's so fat. See that red rag around her leg? That's a wonderful thing, and the highest distinction a duck can get. It shows that they don't want to lose her and that she's to have special attention from man and beast. Shake yourselves. Don't turn your toes in. A well-bred duckling turns his toes way out, just as his father and mother do, this way. So then, now duck your heads and say quack. They did as she told them, but the other ducks around them looked on and said right out loud, "See here, must we have this brood too, just as if there weren't enough of us already? And fie, what an ugly-looking fellow that duckling is. We won't stand for him." One duck charged up and bit his neck. "Let him alone," his mother said. "He isn't doing any harm." "Possibly not," said the duck who bit him, "but he's too big and strange. Therefore he needs a good whacking." "What nice-looking children you have, mother," said the old duck with the rag around her leg. "They're all pretty except that one. He didn't come out so well. It's a pity you can't hatch him again." "That can't be managed, your ladyship," said the mother. "He isn't so handsome, but he's as good as he can be, and he swims just as well as the rest, or I should say even a little bit better than they do. I hope his looks will improve with age, and after a while he won't seem so big. He took too long in the egg, and that's why his figure isn't all that it should be." She pinched his neck and preened his feathers. "Moreover, he's a drake, so it won't matter so much. I think he will be quite strong, and I'm sure he will amount to something." "The other ducklings are pretty enough," said the old duck. Now make yourselves right at home, and if you find an eel's head, you may bring it to me." So they felt quite at home. But the poor duckling, who had been the last one out of his egg, and who looked so ugly, was pecked and pushed about and made fun of by the ducks and the chickens as well. "He's too big," said they all. The turkey gobbler, who thought himself an emperor because he was born wearing spurs, puffed up like a ship under full sail and bore down upon him, gobbling and gobbling until he was red in the face. The poor duckling did not know where he dared stand or where he dared walk. He was so sad because he was so desperately ugly, and because he was the laughingstock of the whole barnyard. So it went on the first day, and after that things went from bad to worse. The poor duckling was chased and buffeted about by everyone. Even his own brothers and sisters abused him. "Oh," they would always say, "how we wish the cat would catch you, you ugly thing." And his mother said, "How I do wish you were miles away." The ducks nipped him and the hens pecked him, and the girl who fed them kicked him with her foot. So he ran away, and he flew over the fence. The little birds in the bushes darted up in a fright. "That's because I'm so ugly," he thought, and closed his eyes, but he ran on just the same until he reached the great marsh where the wild ducks lived. There he lay all night long, weary and disheartened. When morning came, the wild ducks flew up to have a look at their new companion. "What sort of creature are you?" they asked, as the duckling turned in all directions, bowing his best to all of them. "You are terribly ugly," they told him, "but that's nothing to us so long as you don't marry into our family." Poor duckling! Marriage certainly had never entered his mind. All he wanted was for them to let him lie among the reeds and drink a little water from the marsh. There he stayed for 2 whole days. Then he met 2 wild geese, or rather wild ganders, for they were males. They had not been out of the shell very long, and that's what made them so sure of themselves. "Say there, comrade," they said, "you're so ugly that we've taken a fancy to you. Come with us and be a bird of passage. In another marsh nearby there are some fetching wild geese, all nice young ladies who know how to quack. You're so ugly that you'll completely turn their heads." Bing, bang, shots rang in the air, and these 2 ganders fell dead among the reeds. The water was red with their blood. Bing, bang, the shots rang, and as whole flocks of wild geese flew up from the reeds, another volley crashed. A great hunt was in progress. The hunters lay under cover all around the marsh, and some even perched on branches of trees that overhung the reeds. Blue smoke rose like clouds from the shade of the trees and drifted far out over the water. The bird dogs came, splash, splash, through the swamp, bending down the reeds and the rushes on every side. This gave the poor duckling such a fright that he twisted his head, about to hide it under his wing. But at that very moment, a fearfully big dog appeared right beside him. His tongue lolled out of his mouth and his wicked eyes glared horribly. He opened his wide jaws, flashed his sharp teeth, and splash, splash, on he went without touching the duckling. "Thank heavens," he sighed. "I'm so ugly that even the dog won't bother to bite me." He lay perfectly still while the bullets splattered through the reeds as shot after shot was fired. It was late in the day before things became quiet again, and even then the poor duckling didn't dare move. He waited several hours before he ventured to look about him, and then he scurried away from that marsh as fast as he could go. He ran across field and meadows. The wind was so strong that he had to struggle to keep his feet. Late in the evening, he came to a miserable little hovel so ramshackle that it did not know which way to tumble, and that was the only reason it still stood. The wind struck the duckling so hard that the poor little fellow had to sit down on his tail to withstand it. The storm blew stronger and stronger, but the duckling noticed that one hinge had come loose, and the door hung so crooked that he could squeeze through the crack into the room, and that's just what he did. Here lived an old woman with her cat and her hen. The cat, whom she called Sunny, could arch his back, purr, and even make sparks, though for that you had to stroke his fur the wrong way. The hen had short little legs, so she was called Chickie Shortleg. She laid good eggs, and the old woman loved her as if she had been her own child. In the morning, they were quick to notice the strange duckling. The cat began to purr, and the hen began to cluck. What on earth? The old woman looked around, but she was short-sighted, and she mistook the duckling for a fat duck that had lost its way. That was a good catch, she said. Now I shall have duck eggs, unless it's a drake. We must try to find out. So the duckling was tried out for 3 weeks, but not one egg did he lay. In this house, the cat was master and the hen was mistress. They always said, "we and the world," for they thought themselves half of the world and the much better half at that. The duckling thought that there might be more than one way of thinking, but the hen would not hear of it. "Can you lay eggs?" she asked. "No." "Then be so good as to hold your tongue." The cat asked, "Can you arch your back, purr, or make sparks?" "No." "Then keep your opinion to yourself when sensible people are talking." The duckling sat in a corner, feeling most despondent. Then he remembered the fresh air and the sunlight. Such a desire to go swimming on the water possessed him that he could not help telling the hen about it. "What on earth has come over you?" the hen cried. "You haven't a thing to do, and that's why you get such silly notions. Lay us an egg or learn to purr, and you'll get over it." "But it's so refreshing to float on the water," said the duckling. "So refreshing to feel it rise over your head as you dive to the bottom." "Yes, it must be a great pleasure," said the hen. "I think you must have gone crazy. Ask the cat, who's the wisest fellow I know, whether he likes to swim or dive down in the water. Of myself I say nothing, but ask the old woman, our mistress. There's no one on earth wiser than she is. Do you imagine she wants to go swimming and feel the water rise over her head?" "You don't understand me," said the duckling. "Well, if we don't, who would? Surely you don't think you're cleverer than the cat and the old woman, to say nothing of myself. Don't be so conceited, child. Just thank your Maker for all the kindness we have shown you. Didn't you get into this snug room and fall in with people who can tell you what's what? But you are such a numbskull that it's no pleasure to have you around. Believe me, I tell you this for your own good. I say unpleasant truths, but that's the only way you can know who are your friends. Be sure now that you lay some eggs. See to it that you also learn to purr or make sparks." I think I'd better go out into the wide world," said the duckling. Let me try that again, Paul. "I think I'd better go out into the wide world," said the duckling. "Suit yourself," said the hen. So off went the duckling. He swam on the water and dived down into it, but he still was slighted by every living creature because of his ugliness. Autumn came on. The leaves in the forest turned yellow and brown. The wind took them and whirled them about. The heavens looked cold as the low clouds hung heavy with snow and hail. Perched on the fence, the raven screamed, "Caw, caw," and trembled with cold. It made one shiver to think of it. Pity the poor little duckling. One evening, just as the sun was setting in splendor, a great flock of large, handsome birds appeared out of the reeds. The duckling had never seen birds so beautiful. They were dazzling white with long, graceful necks. They were swans. They uttered a very strange cry as they unfurled their magnificent wings to fly from this cold land away to warmer countries and to open waters. They went up so high, so very high, that the ugly little duckling felt a strange uneasiness come over him as he watched them. He went around and around in the water like a wheel. He craned his neck to follow their course and gave a cry so shrill and strange that he frightened himself. He could not forget them, those splendid, happy birds. When he could no longer see them, he dived to the very bottom, and when he came up again, he was quite beside himself. He did not know what birds they were or whither they were bound, yet he loved them more than anything he had ever loved before. It was not that he envied them, for how could he ever dare dream of wanting their marvelous beauty for himself? He would have been grateful if only the ducks would have tolerated him. the poor, ugly creature that he was. The winter grew cold, so bitterly cold that the duckling had to swim to and fro in the water to keep it from freezing over. But every night, the hole in which he swam kept getting smaller and smaller. Then it froze so hard that the duckling had to paddle continuously to keep the crackling ice from closing in upon him. At last, too tired to move, he was frozen fast in the ice. Early that morning, a farmer came by, and when he saw how things were, he went out on the pond, broke away the ice with his wooden shoe, and carried the duckling home to his wife. There the duckling revived, but when the children wished to play with him, he thought they meant to hurt him. Terrified, he fluttered into the milk pail, splashing the whole room with milk. The woman shrieked and threw up her hands as he flew into the butter tub, and then in and out of the meal barrel. Imagine what he looked like now. The woman screamed and lashed out at him with the fire tongs. The children tumbled over each other as they tried to catch him, and they laughed and shouted. Luckily, the door was open, and the duckling escaped through it into the bushes, where he lay down in the newly fallen snow, as if in a daze. But it would be too sad to tell of all the hardships and wretchedness he had to endure during this cruel winter. When the warm sun shone once more, the duckling was still alive among the reeds of the marsh. The larks began to sing again. It was a beautiful springtime. Then, quite suddenly, he lifted his wings. They swept through the air much more strongly than before, and their powerful strokes carried him far. Before he quite knew what was happening, he found himself in a great garden where apple trees bloomed. The lilacs filled the air with sweet scent and hung in clusters from long green branches that bent over a winding stream. Oh, but it was lovely there in the freshness of spring. From the thicket before him came 3 lovely white swans. They ruffled their feathers and swam lightly in the stream. The duckling recognized these noble creatures, and a strange feeling of sadness came upon him. I shall fly near these royal birds, and they will peck me to bits, because I, who am so very ugly, dare to go near them, but I don't care. Better be killed by them than to be nipped by the ducks, pecked by the hens, kicked about by the henyard girl, or suffer such misery in winter. So he flew into the water and swam toward the splendid swans. They saw him and swept down upon him with their rustling feathers raised. "Kill me," said the poor creature, and he bowed his head down over the water to wait for death. But what did he see there mirrored in the clear stream? He beheld his own image, and it was no longer the reflection of a clumsy, dirty, gray bird, ugly and offensive. He himself was a swan. Being born in a duckyard does not matter if only you are hatched from a swan's egg. He felt quite glad that he had come through so much trouble and misfortune, for now he had a fuller understanding of his own good fortune and of beauty when he met with it. The great swans swam all around him and stroked him with their bills. Several little children came into the garden to throw grain and bits of bread upon the water. The smallest child cried, "Here's a new one," and the others rejoiced, "Yes, a new one has come." They clapped their hands, danced around, and ran to bring their father or mother. And they threw bread and cake upon the water, while they all agreed, "The new one is the most handsome of all. He's so young and good-looking." The old swans bowed in his honor. Then he felt very bashful and tucked his head under his wing. He did not know what this was all about. He felt so very happy, but he wasn't at all proud, for a good heart never grows proud. He thought about how he had been persecuted and scorned, and now he heard them all call him the most beautiful of all beautiful birds. The lilacs dipped their clusters into the stream before him, and the sun shone so warm and so heartening. He rustled his feathers and held his slender neck high as he cried out with a full heart, I never dreamed there could be so much happiness when I was the ugly duckling.
There's something about Hans Christian Andersen telling the story in such a lengthy, lyrical way. Puts us into a bit of a dreamy state as we kind of move from scene to scene and empathizing with this poor creature's suffering.
It's been a long time since I've read the whole story, and hearing it and speaking it out loud really reevokes what a poignant tale it is. This is not just a story that is in the realm of fairy tales by Hans Christian Andersen. There's a real world corollary here that I think talks about sort of early life experience and how important it is. And I owe this to a member of our Jungian community, Carrie Remmel, who told me about Felicity the goose. And this is a goose who was part of Konrad Lorenz, an ethologist in Germany, who studied imprinting behavior of birds. And this particular goose, named Felicity, or Feli for short, was isolated right after she was born, and she was put in a room where there were no other geese, no other animals, not even human beings. She was fed by a machine, and the only sound she heard was the thermostat that would click when it adjusted the temperature, and she would run toward it. And then when she got there, she would wag her head from side to side in a sort of exaggerated form of no. And then she would run away in fear. So she was torn between attachment and fear. And this dilemma would stay with her for a lot of her life. So she missed the crucial time that geese and other animals have for imprinting or basic bonding. She was let out of the room to roam with the other geese, but she was a real misfit. She had not had the normal period of learning and being socialized, bonding and attaching to this is how we do things as geese. So she never developed normal attachments and stayed on the outskirts of the flock, didn't play with the other geese or goslings. She ate all by herself, waiting for everybody else to finish. If she was approached in a way that elicited her fear, she would wag her head again from side to side. She ran away from males. She couldn't bond. Then they decided to see, when she started to exhibit some nest-building behaviors, they gave her some goose eggs to sit on. So Feli knew what to do, and she sat on the eggs, but not for long enough. So they didn't hatch. So later she was given another clutch of goose eggs to hatch. And this time she sat on them longer. They hatched, but she didn't know what to do after they had hatched. And so they all died. And then, pushing this experiment even further, they decided to give her some duck eggs to sit on because ducks are hardier at birth. So she did sit on the eggs. She didn't reject them, but she didn't do anything for them either after they hatched. And the ducklings, being independent little critters, could just walk down to the water and to kind of take care of themselves. They all slept apart, the ducklings and Feli, in two different groups. But one night there was a storm with thunder and lightning, and the ducklings sought shelter under her wings, and she accepted them. And then after that, in kind of a reversal of the usual thing, the ducklings would lead the way down to the water, and Feli would follow them. Instead of being the one to lead them down, she followed. And eventually, another goose who was also sort of a misfit joined this flock, and he courted her. And after having had the experience with the ducklings, Feli knew more of what to do and accepted him, and they became a pair. That lasted until Feli's partner died, some years later. And so I'm moved by this story too, of what it's like in the natural world not to have the kind of attachment, bonding, socialization that a goose requires, or that our ugly duckling should have had.
Well, I think the real life experimental data that you shared gives us some much more realistic view of how difficult it is to overcome early infant adversity. That the brain and its neuroplasticity really does have certain windows. And when the correct stimulus isn't introduced, it's very difficult for people to learn some of these foundational experiences later in life, and obviously other creatures as well. Although there is this encouragement that if fate brings us the right circumstances, that life can lead us incrementally forward towards itself, towards engagement, towards some hope of connection.
I'm aware in the story, and have certainly, I had plenty of opportunity to observe this, that our ugly duckling does what children do and stays with them until adulthood often, and until a therapeutic process often, that when the duckling runs away and flies over the fence, the little birds in the bushes darted up in a fright. And the duckling says, "That's because I'm so ugly," he thought, and closed his eyes. Then later, when other birds are being hunted by the hunters, and the dog comes splashing through the marsh, the dog ignores the duckling, and our ugly duckling says, "Oh, thank heavens, I'm so ugly that even the dog won't bother to bite me." This early experience of trauma causes the ugly duckling to turn it back on himself, to personalize it. Of course, the birds flew up over the fence because this ugly duckling gosling had startled them flying over the fence. The dog was intent on finding the birds that had been shot to retrieve them, but the ugly duckling took it personally, that I can't be bothered with.
And that's such a common story that we run into in analysis, that coming from a really wounded frame of reference, so many of us will misinterpret the events around us day by day, moment by moment, and frame them from this early childhood lens. It must be because I have these faults. It must be because I have these traits. And often the assumption is that people are really out to get them. Other people are rallying to continue to deliver insult where no insult is intended. And that's a really pernicious, self-fulfilling cycle, because if an individual who's been wounded is convinced that they've been insulted or mistreated, as adults, they'll often rally some kind of an angry response, some kind of a shove back, which then does elicit the rejection that they were fantasizing. So it's a tragic reinforcing process, but it starts with the expectation that the world of my childhood hasn't changed, and all the same figures are here with different faces.
It's sometimes called the fundamental attribution error or something like that, that we attribute something to us personally when it's actually in the situation. So for the ugly duckling, it's just that he flew over a fence and startled the birds. That's the situation. But his attribution error is like, oh, it must be me. And same thing with the dog. He's just after birds to retrieve, and that's the situation. But we take the meaning in, we take too many things personally, Because of the very, very early wound, which is that's what happened. That the ugly duckling wasn't accepted, wasn't cared for, wasn't loved. And so those early experiences of lack of bonding, acceptance, safety, what we call secure attachment, did not happen. For children, when they're upset or needing something, a secure attachment is marked by people who are then present. That kids want to have proximity. They want care. They want responsiveness. That's our safety, is in the other. And when the other is responsive, present, attuned, we are securely attached. Whereas the ugly duckling, of course, was not.
I find myself thinking about those early moments in the tale where the mother duck is trying to advocate for the ugly duckling, saying, well, he is a strong swimmer and he is a drake, and so maybe being pretty isn't going to be all that important for him. But the larger community's rejection of the ugly duckling makes it kind of impossible for the mother to maintain this protective esteem for her child. And the prevailing attitude kind of sweeps what little positive regard that she initially had. One of the things that's so sad and understandable, that when the ugly duckling runs away, he also deprives himself of any kind of an interpretive lens. So another thing that a securely attached child will get from a good enough parent is the parent's philosophy about how other people work, what other people are, what other things are, as well as describe the child to themselves. We can sometimes, as children, literally run away, which is very tragic, but we can also run away inside ourselves so that we dissociate, we hide away. And when we're not connected to any of these advising adults around us, we don't have a philosophy about what's going on in the other person. We don't know how cats behave. We don't know how chickens behave. We don't really know what they are. So we take everything that the environment presents as an absolute truth without any kind of context around it. So an interesting study that was done many years ago, which right now may seem a little ancillary, but they were trying to understand why Japanese students do so much better than American students in testing and in educational environments. And one of the things that they noticed is that when a child has a success, American parents will generally just praise them, say how wonderful it is that they're successful. But Japanese mothers would explain how they were successful. Will say, oh, you got up early and you read your book, and then we came home and we had cookies, and then we studied the math, and then we did that every Thursday, and then you got a good night's rest, and then on Monday when you went in to take the test. And so the parent creates a narrative explaining why and how things happen in the world. And what we can see in the ugly duckling is there's no one really to explain anything to him. And so just as you were pointing out, Deb, he just echoes these criticisms that were delivered to him.
The only kind of meaning he can make from all of his difficult experiences is that it must be me, must be because I'm ugly, something's wrong with me. So I'm thinking about this as a really poignant portrait of early shame, which very different from guilt. Guilt is I did something wrong, and people have told me about it, and my behavior is the problem. But with shame, it's I myself am the problem. There's something inherently wrong with me that I'm not responded to in those ways that you're talking about, Joseph, of the positive regard, interpretive lens, closeness, proximity of attachment that leads to profound, subtle, but substantial feelings of inadequacy and shame. I don't measure up. I somehow, in some way, am tainted or flawed. And I know it's me because our ugly duckling has no other possible meaning that he himself can come up with, rather than if he had had one of the good Japanese parent would have said, well, you're bigger and scruffier. And by the way, swan goslings are very big and scruffy. They're sort of brownish gray, and they don't really have any outward indication of how glorious they're destined to become. But no one can explain. Don't worry about it. You're a swan. This is just how we all start out.
And so when an analysand comes in and they've had similar kinds of wounds, it's often very mysterious because there are two dimensions to it. One is perhaps memories of being actively criticized, and those at least can be processed, although often the feeling tone around it is confused. One of the confrontations is to really analyze some of those things and to discern whether now, 40 years later, whether that really makes sense and if it's true. But much more problematic is that when the individual looks at themselves as a child, there's something that we call a lacuna. And I love the word lacuna. It's an old analytic term, and it just means there's an absence. There's just an empty space there. So because of the lack of mirroring, the lack of assistance in knowing who we are and how we are in the world, there's an enormous blank spot inside of the psyche. It's difficult for us to identify what's missing, in the same way that if a child is born colorblind or can't see the color green, let's say, it's very difficult for others to notice sometimes that they can't see that particular color, but it's difficult later on when somebody tries to describe green if it's not something you've ever seen. So there's this blank place inside of us, and around it is just suffering and shame and confusion. Part of the process which we see in the fairy tale is this ability to catch at least an initial glimpse of who we are, as the ugly duckling does when he bends his head down and looks into the water, as well as the feedback that he gets from the other swans, so that he begins to fill in this blank space inside of himself. I want to circle back to that moment towards the end. He's in utter despair, and life is barely worth living. And he bows his head down, thinking that this will be the fatal blow, that he's submitting to fate in whatever it's going to deliver to him, or perhaps will end this misery. And it's in that darkest moment that he looks in a place that apparently he's never looked before.
Yeah.
It's never occurred to him to look straight down into the water. And he catches the first image of his real self, which is profoundly surprising. Jung wrote rather boldly that sometimes in a deep analysis, people will brush against a suicidal feeling that can be very frightening. And that dark moment, that nadir in someone's life, can often be the place where they have a moment of truly seeing something about the self, which then revives them and allows them to return from the depression or the agony and begin an ascent back into a more fertile life. So there's something very powerful about the agony that allows him to reflect.
The other aspect of reflection is the mirroring by the swans on the lake, of that they see him as like them, they welcome him. There's the positive regard of, hey, how are you? Come join us. And that is what every infant and child needs to see in caregivers' eyes of family members, nursery school teachers, grade school teachers, is that kind of delight of not just, hello, you're another student, or it's time to give you some food, but I am delighted to see you. You delight me. And that kind of enjoyment, welcome, is priceless. It is not enough to provide, sort of food and care and education. The feeling function is hugely important. It cannot be overemphasized. And so the swans reflect him to himself as being worthwhile, as being enjoyable, as being welcomed. I must be okay now, because look at what I see of myself reflected in their behavior. So he has a dual lens, the objective view of himself in the water, of, wow, how I thought I looked is actually not how I do look. And then that social reflection that is provided by the other swans and the children throwing him bits of bread.
That there's that dance between this moment of introspective realization and then the need to collect evidence in the outer world that we're not just crazy, that this could be true, this thing we've discovered. I'm moved by the first gesture, that the great swans swam all around him and stroked him with their bills. This is such a instinctive wisdom, I think, in Anderson's work, that as it is for many of us with a trauma history, that the psychological corrections are easy to dismiss, reading self-help books, maybe having relatives tell us, oh, we look fine, or we're wonderful people. But there's a way that can be discounted. The first time someone with wounded self-image is received physically, the first lover, the first person that kisses them and really looks in their eyes, the first person that tells them they're desirable and they're wonderful and touches their body intimately in a way that they feel very received and desired. That is a kind of irrefutable moment. The rejection of the childhood may really not define the entire future. So I love that gentle touching that the swans provide. Also, in a more clinical note, there was a study done probably about maybe 10 years now that was comparing the current psychotherapeutic treatments for PTSD and massage therapy to treat PTSD. and the results, the positive results, were comparable. So there is something about gentle, conscious body work, and that we can go through the body to begin this process of coming back to life and perceiving ourselves differently.
I think that is such an important element that you've just touched on, that infants and children and adults need to be touched. We need to know that our physical selves elicit that kind of contact from other people. And if we go all the way back and trace the taproot to the earliest days of infancy, touch, speech, eye contact actually regulate the baby's body temperature. They help with the pruning of brain cells that we all come with, but we don't need them all. For example, we don't need all of the language potential that we're born with. We need to start learning the language we're going to speak. And that's why mothers talk to their tiny 2-day-old infants. Eye contact grows dendrites. It goes on and on of how important the physical proximity and touch are, and that it's so important to us that others want to touch us. As teenagers, someone wants to hold us, someone wants to kiss us, someone wants to run their fingers through our hair.
It's a huge, huge experience, particularly if we've been feeling really bad about ourselves, and questioning whether or not we have any value in any realm.
Right. And that sometimes if there's really been a lot of neglect or abuse, how different are we from Felicity the goose, where that push-pull between fear and attraction hangs us up, that we're not as able as the duckling in Hans Christian Andersen's story to say, oh my God, this is great. Golly gee whiz, I thought they were going to kill me, but it turns out I'm a swan too, and now, happily ever after. It is much harder and yet very possible to recover from this kind of trauma. But it doesn't happen just in one moment out there on the water. It's a process.
What the story about the experiment that was thrust upon Felicity, the goose, it reminds me of a number of individuals that I've worked with that had very unusual upbringings, very deprived. The idea that they were given enough food and perhaps shelter and very little else for all kinds of reasons, by the way. And so the slightest sound, like the ticking of the thermostat, brings this feeling of hope, but also total confusion because it has nothing to do with interaction. It's almost like a promise of contact that's never really delivered. It's like being that kid in the crib, hearing the parents talking or walking around in the living room as the child is crying, but they never come in the room. So the sound of the parents is just like a ticking clock that promises something like the exciting withholding object, but never actually delivers very much. And so like Felicity, some of us wind up in the world, doing our own thing, staying on the edge and the periphery of life, walking around far away from people. But it's not until something vulnerable needs us that a heroic instinct can often rise up. So for some of my adolescents in that state, adopting a dog, and adopting a rescue dog sometimes can be profoundly healing. Something vulnerable that needs us, something that won't reject us, something that will love us and does love us unfailingly as we hold it close to us, something that we don't think is going to or could harm us. And so then bestowing our loving kindness upon them rather, feels safe and possible. That really can be a turning point, an enormous turning point.
And that is exactly what happened for Feli the goose, is that when she was able to take the frightened little ducklings under her wing because of the thunderstorm and the rain and shelter them, she was able to reconnect with her own ability to love. And that enabled her to bond with this other goose who was introduced late and who was also a bit of a misfit. But we want to be loved, and that teaches us how to love. And sometimes, as with Feli the goose or adopting a dog, gives us back a part of ourselves that is vital, and that I have that capability. Unlike the ugly duckling who expects to be killed, of when we reach out and have a call to give something of ourselves, take something under our wing, as it were. It's a profound turning point and very healing.
So when we cannot find any loveliness in ourselves, sometimes the first step is that we find something lovely outside of ourselves, like in the new puppy, or perhaps the stranded bunny in the yard that needs to be fed by hand, or any of the other vulnerable creatures that might come to us, call out for aid. And we find them so lovely and lovable. And in that way, we are inviting some memory of that capacity to experience that. And coming full circle around this idea of trauma work. This is an idea that I've been thinking a lot about and lecturing a little bit about recently, is that the goal of trauma work is not simply to recall the intolerable feelings of childhood. That is a stage of the work, because we have to sew back together our memories and our feeling states, and also sew our narrative back into a logical sequence. But that's only one stage. When all of that happens adequately enough, hidden in our traumatogenic memories is a capacity to experience something that was shut off and put away. So the ugly duckling might remember all the times that they were rejected, all of the suffering and near death that he experienced, might be able to recall all of that in a very detailed narrative, but he will become whole when he remembers what it was like to want to connect, which is a capacity. And when we remember that we even want to connect, that then something of the self has come back to us that was put away and hidden behind the wall of very painful memories.
That's really lovely, Joseph. And when we can shift from the fear, the avoidance, the desire to escape, and move into our desire and find that kernel that is in all of us of that wish to connect. I want you. I'm going out toward a you. Of that, despite a history of privation and emotional neglect, there is still a kind of real abundance that's when we find something in ourselves, is our capacity to love.
That sounds like a perfect time to transition into our dream.
Before we enter into today's dream, I would like to invite all of you who like our podcast and especially like our dream work to go on our website, thisjungianlife.com, take a look at Dream School. We describe all the different 12 modules, all of the opportunities to interact with us, to join a dream group of your own, right there on the website. So take a look, wade into this a little bit more deeply, and see if what we have to offer as a dream interpretation, 12-month, year-long module interests you.
Our dreamer today is a 40-year-old female who works as an accountant. And here's her dream. I was eating at a restaurant with a familiar group of people, though many of them were just familiar dream people, not actually people I know in real life. I felt something on my foot and thought I had dropped a piece of food, so I looked down. It was a small frog jumping across my foot. I picked it up and recalled feeling repulsed by it. I started cutting it across its back and pulling its legs off, but it was dying. It remained alive and kept looking at me, almost as if it was begging me to stop. Suddenly I had the thought, why am I doing this? Why didn't I just take it outside and set it free? Then I knew I couldn't fully kill it. So I asked someone at the table to come outside with me, and I wanted them to finish the job, and to kill the frog so it wouldn't suffer anymore. The dream ended with the other person killing the frog and me crying uncontrollably at my callousness and gratuitous violence towards the frog. For context, she writes, I am about 5 weeks away from delivering my daughter, my second child, as well as having my partner come and live with me in my home. So there's a lot of change happening all at once. The main feelings in the dream were disgust, confusion, sadness, and fear. And a bit more, she adds, I've been feeling very overwhelmed about my partner moving in with me since the relationship is kind of tense and we struggle to connect romantically, and I often doubt that we're a good fit. But we are having a child, so I feel obligated to follow through with the relationship. I feel kind of trapped. It's a lot of intense feeling in this dream.
I'm contrasting the very beginning of this dream with what happens next. She's at a restaurant with a group of people eating. So here's a pleasant experience that you will be fed by other people. It's a social situation. And then along comes this frog, a piece of the underworld. I think of the fairy tale about the princess and the frog, and how she has to accept the frog. Her father tells her in this story she drops a golden ball into a pond and is distraught because she's lost it. And the frog comes up and says, hey, guess what? I could bring it up to you, but you have to be my friend. You have to take me home with you. Let me eat off your plate. Let me sit on your pillow when you sleep. And later on, the princess says, okay, because she just wants her ball back. And then when the frog shows up, she doesn't want anything to do with it, but her father says, hey, look, a deal is a deal. You gave him your word, so you have to follow through. And eventually, our little princess gets so fed up with this slimy frog following her around everywhere that she throws it against the wall and it becomes a prince. And I'm thinking there is a lot of that fairy tale because there is a deep substrate psychically, goes back millennia in all of us, of a fairy tale and individual psychology. So here is this frog, and our dream ego doesn't like it. It repulses her, and she tries to destroy it.
The frog is a surprising element. We're at a restaurant. For the most part, we don't expect a frog to jump on our foot. Although I have to say, I have been in some more tropical environments where there's suddenly a gecko right there on your table, or an iguana is just a few feet away. So I think, depending on where you live, little creatures might be a more constant presence than it is, let's say, in the U.S. where we are. But something under the table, something unconscious, something unexpected, something extraordinarily alien in consciousness has announced its presence, and it's touched the foot, which is highly specific. So the foot is able to sense something's there under the table, but it can't quite interpret what it is. So it's this calling down underneath the table to take a look, to figure out what's going on. So it's not uncommon when we're doing dream work or any kind of depth psychological work that we'll feel something brush against the psyche, a vague memory, an impression, a feeling, something that's indistinct. And it can give us kind of a shiver up the back. Like suddenly feeling someone's behind us. And it's quite difficult for us to know how to orient towards the unseen. But she discovers that it is a frog. Now, frogs are really interesting symbols, and if we take a James Hillman perspective, he would often want to know about this particular frog. Is it a toad? Because frogs generally live in water, toads on land. Although down in North Carolina, where I'm usually at, there are these incredible little tree frogs that kind of just show up like little brilliant emerald jewels. They'll just kind of stick to the outside of your windows, and kind of find them there at night. Just their little suction cup hands. So frogs are really interesting because they show up in all kinds of habitats. And I think it would be rather unusual to have a frog under the table. It's in the wrong environment, likely to be the wrong environment. Frogs are often associated with transformation in as much as we can observe them going from eggs to tadpoles to that middle stage where they're half tadpole and they've got legs on them, eventually to being adult frogs that can live in the water as well as out of the water, and they can swim and they can leap into the air, and they have all these capacities. So there's an enormous transformative potential that's often associated with a frog. Some frogs have poison that they secrete, others hallucinogenic properties, others are benign. So all kinds of interesting adaptations that frogs have. And this incredible adaptive, transformative process has kind of announced itself inside of her. And her first reaction to this primal energy is to feel repulsed.
I'm thinking about how you said, Joseph, that here it is, a frog, and it's in the wrong environment. We don't expect it in a restaurant. And frogs, for the most part, can't stay out of the water for terribly long. But they go into the unconscious of water, and they're air breathing, and they're up on land. So they traverse those realms. But I'm also thinking about our fairy tale, that the transformation was when the princess, in a fit of what seems like just egocentricity and willfulness, throws the frog against the wall, and it transforms it into a prince. So I'm thinking in this dream that even though the dream ego sort of does these horrific things and then feels horrible about it. I wonder if, like the fairy tale, there is some transformative process going on here that is necessary of getting in touch with her aggression, her anger, her capacity for a kind of cruelty that we all have. And here she is about to give birth to a second child and have her partner move in. And wouldn't it be natural to have a lot of mixed feelings about both of those changes in life? It's a big deal. Have a second child and have a new partner, and of course her first child.
She starts to dissect it, interestingly.
That's right. She's dissecting it.
It reminds me of disturbing experiences I had in junior high school. Luckily, we didn't have to euthanize live frogs. They came out of a formaldehyde bucket, poke around in them, but it was very gruesome. And it's quite an initiation into both anatomy and scientific experimentation on animals. It's difficult, but it is a part of modern reality. So she's repulsed by it, and she starts cutting it across the back and trying to pull its legs off. She tries to cut it into pieces. Now, if I step back and think, well, that might be an ego approach to an inner image, the way we'll have a tendency to want to dissect a dream figure, dissect an instinct, try to cut it open, look inside of it, take it into its various parts. But of course, if we're too intellectual about something, if we're a bit heartless about the inner images, they can lose their energetic capacity. They can wind up not allowing us to develop a relationship to the nuance of the symbol. So there's something here about when the ego feels repulsed by something, then she wants to cut it open and dissect it, take it apart, which in one sense, as you were saying, Deb, has a positive valence. I mean, there's something about analyzing the things that bother us and trying to peer to the inside of what it is, and it is an aggressive inquiry into something.
I'm also thinking of taking your image of dissecting and the objective stance that requires. One step further to dismembering, because she pulls the frog's legs off. There is something about dismembering that is completely gruesome. It's horrifying. We hear stories about it. It's an image sometimes in fairy tales, most particularly the Bluebeard story. It goes so against nature to pull something apart in a very unscientific way. And yet, it is also a precursor to a kind of a remembering. And the dismembering process psychologically can be very, very painful and put things together in a new way and in a new order. So our dream ego is crying uncontrollably at her callousness and violence toward the frog. And yet, I'm wondering what has to come apart in a very primal way in order to be reborn in a new way.
When the frog is dissected, there is a release of affect, if we just think about it sequentially. So the ego is determined that the frog must be dismembered. There are dismembered gods like Osiris, that she doesn't have the determination in herself to kill the frog. She reaches into some other part of the psyche to come and help her with dispatching the frog. And in the killing of the frog, all of these tears are released, and a capacity to reflect on her traits of callousness and gratuitous violence. Now that seems like a strange sequence in the outer world. We might say, well, I wish we'd realized that before we'd harmed an animal, but the rules of the inner world are different. And these are symbolic metaphors. So the dream maker allows the ego to do what it chooses, to want to dissect the frog versus, toss it in the bush, to really be in touch with this irrational need to kill the frog, and then to get in touch with her remorse and her guilt, and more importantly, this objective stance of, wow, I can be really callous, and I can indulge in gratuitous violence. And the dream maker, which often is the self, is holding up a mirror. Von Franz felt that dreams were a snapshot of how the self perceives us. And so in this mirror, the self is saying, without judgment, very, very dispassionate. Yep, well, that's there, so now it's kind of up to the ego. What am I going to do with that? What do I want to do with this awareness of a shadow capacity, which I think, Deb, you were talking about before? In Princess and the Frog, or the Frog Prince, there's a way in which it all seems such a happy ending. She throws the frog against the wall and he becomes a beautiful prince, and they're instantly in love. I think the psychological process of that is rather slow and complicated. But here, the frog, I think, represents something of the shadow, something that is cursed. Princes or princesses can be cursed, and then they become frogs. There's a curse there, and as the curse is engaged, there is a need to understand these qualities of callousness and gratuitous violence, and to somehow take hold of that, to take a stance around it, to accept it, as we all have to do with our shadow work. Like, yes, well, that is true. I do have those qualities. They're difficult for me. They're probably difficult for other people. And this is the psychic situation. So what am I going to do about it? What's my conscious stance around this primal reality?
I think there's a lot in what you've just said, and I think it really gives a very positive telos or forward arc trajectory to the dream, that the dream ego does the dissecting, dismembering of the frog, and then incorporates that with regret and grief. Oh, I'm so sorry about having done this. So there is an integration of both of those elements, the shadow element of callousness and violence, and the ego capacity to regret it, to then get back in touch with an empathic place that says, oh my God. And this is exactly what Jung talks about in the Red Book, which is all those things we are, that we have, inner murderers and inner sadists and all those things, and that we are those things. And when we can recognize it, we're far less likely to act it out. But we like to believe we're good people, and I never would hurt anybody or say anything unkind. But of course we do. So I think this dream is a really important piece of shadow work.
I think so too. And as she feels in the dream that when we first come across shadow, we feel repulsed by it, which is kind of the definition of shadow.
Yes.
And when we see it in other people, we're like, ugh. Of course, the stronger the feeling of aversion, the more relevant it probably is to us. And there we are. And so I don't know whether this dream is related to the partner moving in or not, but if I was going to make a stretch, that as often happens, we project shadow onto our partners or the intimate people around us. We project golden shadow. Often we exaggerate somebody's good qualities, but we'll also exaggerate their bad qualities, which can be very confusing as we're trying to negotiate whether or not we want to make a life with someone. But here, it's particularly around the repulsive part. And so there could be some really important applications of this, that when we feel repulsed by our partner, if this were my dream, I might pause, remember the dream and say, okay, I feel repulsed by something my partner's done. Am I being callous right now? Is there a little kind of angry violence burp happening inside of me as I'm watching somebody do thus and such? Can I hold that reaction in me towards the partner and reflect on that, rather than just show up with a knife, trying to cut the relationship apart? Also, it's really tough being a mom with now 2 children and a brand new baby. There's a lot of primal feeling that comes up, a lot of negative feelings. And sometimes moms will struggle with feelings of being callous or furious, at their children or about their fate of being pregnant, even if they've chosen it. It's a complicated thing with all these primal dynamics inside of it. And as much as we can name them, we have a conscious relationship to them, and then we have choice around them. And that's incredibly helpful.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.
Hello, patrons. We are going to engage a question from one of you, and it is it's always a sort of special time on our Monday morning get-togethers when we can feel connected with you, answer a question, look at a dream, as a way of giving back to you who give to us in a reciprocal way. So here's the question for this week. How can I help my baby develop a strong ego and ethic without the typical focus on right versus wrong, good versus bad, and so on? I am trying to balance the opposites in my own life, and I notice that I get irritated when extended family and friends or even strangers use strategies with their children that seem to be unbalanced.
Of course, one of the challenges is that we don't know how old the child is, because I think there are different developmental processes that children go through, at each age, and shaping our expectations appropriately based on what a child can or cannot do is an important part of teaching them. But we can certainly take the question as it is in general.
Mm-hmm. I was starting out with the fact that this person has a baby. So maybe the baby is a toddler, but, at least I'm thinking pretty young. And I'm remembering very much, with my own kids, of having relatives who interacted with my kids very, very differently from the way that I was at least trying to interact with them. And I don't think overall, unless there's an awful lot of caretaking and time of the baby with other people, that it matters all that much to the child as much as it matters to the mother. I can remember having really strong reactions when somebody, for example, spoke to one of my kids sort of sternly of, no, you can't do that. Or, be nice. You should always be nice. Don't say those things to your sister. That's not nice. Of that, it felt shaming or constraining or harsh or just misattuned. It affected me, I think, much more than it affected my kids, because I, after all, spent far more time with them than anybody else. So, I'm curious a little bit, and I don't know that we can know this, of, what exactly is happening with your baby and extended friends and family that is disturbing. And how often does this happen? And is it you feeling misaligned, which I think happens a lot for parents, that all of a sudden I see sides of my sister that I never saw before, or how I thought my mother would be as a grandmother with her grandchildren versus how she really was. There was a lot of stuff for me with other people, more than I think for my children.
So all of this can happen in a complicated social dynamic, which the questioner is mentioning in terms of the influence of families, friends, strangers, how other people choose to raise their kids. I'm going to zoom far back and take a wider position. And I'm thinking about how often Jung has lamented in his writings that children are pressured to live their parents' unlived lives. And the best gift that a parent might give to a child is to know themselves adequately well. That if we've done our shadow work particularly, and we've really reclaimed a lot of things that we project, it's less likely that we're going to unconsciously pressure our children to live out our own shadow. So, for instance, a parent who's very, very, very timid or meek or excessively agreeable might have a very aggressive shadow. If they don't have a relationship to that, they could very easily unconsciously encourage their child to be aggressive, or more aggressive than they even naturally would. And that many, many examples can flow from that. So the more work that we do, the cleaner the field is for the child to experience themselves. The other unlived life, which I know sounds like a bit of a trope, but I actually still see it all the time, is that, mom had a childhood fantasy of wanting to be a ballet dancer. And lo and behold, for some reason at 7 years old, your daughter's declared that she wants ballet lessons and it's the highest priority. And then all of a sudden, your mom is very involved in making sure that this goes on for a decade. There's probably a connection between the parent's desire to experience something and perhaps unduly pressing the child. Dad wished that he was a football hero, and lo and behold, he's got a lot of energy for his son to be in the football league as soon as he can. And while these things may not be problematic on the surface. There's nothing wrong with playing football or taking ballet lessons. It's more that the child is being unconsciously pressed to do something that may or may not be indigenous or natural to the child. And so that goes again to the work that a parent can do. The second question goes to, what is a strong ego, just in general? What does that even mean? And then secondarily, what does one do in terms of a child? So there's a lot of answers about what is the ego, what helps an ego be really effective, and what interferes with ego functioning. But just in general, very general, I would say is the ego's job is to develop the capacity to make choices. It's a deceptively simple way of saying it. But we, even as adults, are still fighting for the latitude to make choices and not just get swept along by all kinds of complexes and cultural pressures. The more choices that we can make, the wider our experience of being human is. So, helping a child develop a capacity to understand the choices in an environment in very incremental ways, to develop some sense of foresight. Well, yes, you might choose to eat the whole bag of candy, but what happens after that? What can we predict if we eat a pound of candy? Exactly, but as a kid, you don't know that. So choices and consequences, capacities, in a very neutral way, to try to help our children understand that. The ego's role in the psychic environment is to have one foot in the inner life and one foot in the outer life, to be able to stand in both places with equal strength. So we decide we're going to enter the poetry contest in 6th grade. We have an impulse to do that. And then the ego's job is to figure out the rules and the dates and when things are due and maybe get some help or get everything in the outer world lined up. So we're asking the ego over time to mediate between the inner and the outer world. And so that's the caregiving, the primary caregiver's job as well, that we as parents have to mediate the inner and outer world and model that dance.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, really articulating and voicing feelings and making the distinction between what you feel and what you do. That you feel very upset. You really don't want to go upstairs and take a bath right now. I understand. You really don't want to do that. And you can, stay down here for another 5 minutes and continue playing with whatever, and then we'll go. So that that distinction between what you feel is perfectly okay and what you do about it is an entirely different realm. You're really angry at that kid in kindergarten who did this or that or the other thing again, and you cannot pull his hair, or kick him in the pants. But your feelings are legitimate.
I love that, Deb. That's absolutely, that goes into that accurate mirroring.
Mm-hmm.
That a child doesn't have an image of itself, and the ego, in a sense, is an image of oneself. Mm-hmm. And that we develop that image, or the parent helps the child develop that internal image by telling the child its own story.
Mm-hmm.
The story of how it's feeling, because children don't know what their feelings are called.
Right.
Or as you were saying, Deb, the story about the social dynamics in the classroom at 1st grade or kindergarten, but there's a narrative. So if we want our children to be wise, we give them a wise narrative. We want them to be peaceful, we give them a peaceful narrative, but it still needs to be accurate. It needs to line up with reality, because kids' instincts are sharp. They just don't have words necessarily, but they know what's real. The last thing that I might say about ego and ethic is read them fairy tales. Because Grimm's fairy tales and fairy tales from other traditions are ways of symbolically demonstrating to a child how to navigate these strange symbolic inner worlds, and they are almost always dealing with some kind of ethical choosings as well as attaining something, which is such an important part of life. Fairy tales have been used, we think, for hundreds, probably thousands of years to communicate strength and a kind of value system. And the reason certain fairy tales survive is they seem to be still effective at doing that.
Yeah. I really like that you said that, Joseph, and I support it 1,000%, because the unconscious gets it. You know, they really get it when Gretel pushes the horrible old witch into the oven, or when the princess throws the frog against the wall, or when Cinderella persists and takes herself off to the ball. And kids love them, and I would add to get versions of it that have wonderful illustrations. Kids get images, the unconscious gets images, and it's a delight for both parent and child. And
don't be
that's part of it too.
And don't be afraid to read them fairy tales. I know that this stuff happens, dragons get killed and people swing swords, but children's imaginations are full of those primal adventures.
Yes.